Hey, this is Paul, and I've got about an hour before I've got an appointment. By virtue of how calendar worked out this week, I didn't do a rando, so I thought maybe I'd take this hour, which would usually be a rando slot. I adjusted this camera yesterday a little bit. It should usually be a rando slot, but thought that I might jump into here and see what's going on. People usually pop in. There's a whole bunch meeting in the other room. See if anybody wants to talk. Let's rewatch some of the Rebel Wisdom. Zubin Zadamia, is that his name? Conversation about sense making. Thought about the fact that why am I interested in David Fuller's take on a lot of this stuff? Because in a lot of ways, his institution, which is news media, my institution, which is religion, and the medical institution, they're all sort of facing similar things. We got a couple of takers. We got Father Eric and we got Joseph. See who's first to camera. Hey, there's Father Eric. How are you?
Oh, doing all right.
Good.
Got a
Good.
little bit of time this afternoon. Then I
Oh,
got to talk. I got to get ready for tonight with the youth group. So,
okay. Okay. How are things going?
it is bloody beautiful here today. It's above freezing. Oh man, you just live for days like this in February.
Keep those expectations low. There's Joseph. How are you?
Good. Sorry, I
Good.
didn't realize my camera wasn't working.
No, that's okay. That's okay. Yeah, we've had this particular weather pattern keeps us dry here in Sacramento and warm. So it might even hit 70 today. Yeah, night it goes down into the 30s, but during the day it goes up into 70s. Can't beat that. So, well, we have a Protestant minister and a priest, and not not
Not a
not
rabbi.
not quite a rabbi, but walked into a Discord room. So what should we? I've only got about an hour, and I thought I was sitting down and I was thinking about just quick making a video, but I was worried that a lot of the thoughts I had wouldn't fit into that time frame. So I thought, well, I'll jump in here. I never jump in here in the morning, and we'll see. We'll see who joins us. So, any thoughts on what's been going on, or what I've put out, or anything that you've been thinking at all that you wanted to talk to me about, or you wanted to say?
I think you're not wrong about Sam Harris. And I don't know. I got a brother who's kind of in that camp, and I get a lot of the same sort of frustrations whenever I have a little, at this point, interreligious dialogue with him. It's like, well, why do you even do anything, and why do you get upset about anything? If you were actually uh, that apathetic, you know, like, oh, my consciousness is actually an illusion, and there you can't derive any kind of morality. It's like, well, that doesn't match up with the fact that you go to work every day and you know have values and get upset about things. So I don't know. I
Yeah,
find it similarly incomprehensible.
yeah. No, I that's a frequent thought of mine when I listen to him. And someone just sent me a podcast of his where somebody comes on and talks about recurring intrusive memories, basically, that are probably memories of trauma, probably minor trauma. And he asked, is this something I should, maybe get help at seeking resolution from? And Sam Harris's was, well, I find that the best overall thing is to basically to not believe in to disbelieve in yourself. And in other words, the self is the thing that's carrying this trauma. So if you, and I thought, now who's the fidiest here? Because if someone were to walk into my office and talk to me about that, I would say, well, let's talk about what those memories are. And I would probably also refer him potentially to a trauma therapist to say, well, you know, I've got one in my church, maybe a little EMDR or something might get that stuff unstuck, and you might be okay. But to just kind of, I thought, I know churches that would basically say, well, you're not sufficiently living into your identity in Christ. That would be a certain class of Reformed people would sort of lean in that way. And well, okay, that's a fair answer,
But
but
sometimes things are true and not helpful.
right. And in fact, if the presenting problem is, it's kind of like the nail in the head video. It's well, maybe if your arm hurts, see your doctor instead of deciding that the pain that you're experiencing in your arm is a faulty sense of self. It's like, well, why don't you just maybe see the doctor, or maybe take some ibuprofen? Um, and then I ask, well, who's the religious? Who's the purely religious person here, using a particular meta narrative in order to master absolutely everything? So I don't know.
But so this was we were talking about this a little bit in the Voxer, and something the way I was kind of came out when I was framing it was that there's this there's this fundamental tension, right, between right, so science wants to generalize, and because it knows everything about, and not just science, philosophy too, right? I mean, and to some extent philosophy within religion,
Yep.
right? We want to generalize. Once you've undermined, let's say, I mean, you've talked about this, I think, the beginning of your second video quite a bit, Paul, right? Once you undermine people's subjectivist accounts because because brains are whatever they are, and it's only in their head and it's epistemologically faulty, then you need some way to generalize. The only way to do that is kind of statistically, with redundancy, convergence. I mean, all the things that Vervaeke talks about, where you have multiple senses telling you that you have to do that because you have no other way to generalize once you say an individual isn't trustworthy, right? So on the one hand, that has to be the project once you've undermined epistemology. On the other hand, you have, say the intuitionists coming in, represented. So Shari was my main interlocutor this morning. So Shari was saying, well, it's all about love, but love is the opposite of generalizing. Love is very, very particular. You have to love. You can't, it's about this individual, this moment. It can't be communicated well. You can't generalize. I mean, it's hard to express. It's almost ineffable or limited affability, whatever. And there's this kind of third or middle ground, right? That Harris, I think, is. I mean, in some ways, we're all kind of in the middle ground.
Yep.
But on one hand, so Harris, right? He wants the project of generalization and rationality to work. On the other hand, and he says it's your brain is limited. I mean, you're gonna come to experiences and you can't trust them necessarily, and your transcendence is only gonna get you so far. You can't solve society by it, but it still does something. And he doesn't want to dismiss it completely, so he picks this kind of middle ground that's not really so middle. And we're kind of on the other side where we're, but at the same time, right? This is all kind of dependent. This is all conditional on the fact that we psychologize everything.
Mm-hmm.
If religion also, right? So the fact that you're saying who's the religious one here, well, you're only in a part saying that because religion has been psychologized.
Yep.
Yep. So it's hard, and yeah, it's hard for me to kind of divorce these things because I see him very much. The problems with his argument are the same problems with, let's say, the coherence theory of truth or whatever. Because once it's all in your head and it's all about that's what we're trying to show, then of course that's the answer. And this is the weakness of coherence, right? Because you need some correspondent. There is something in reality. You want to take the nail out of your head. You want to go to the doctor because at the end of the day, you can't just live in your head. And he knows that, and he recognizes that to some extent. But it's not that he's more religious or less religious. Religion has decided to find a different balance in this continuum, basically.
Right.
I was just listening. Seekers of Unity, Zevi Slavin, who he had talked with Vervaeke that I suggested to you about Buber, but he just started a 3-part series on the history of the idea of mysticism, and he was talking about in the second episode, he talks about the beginning of the 20th century, basically, where like, so you had a process where first you had nothing, there was no mysticism. The word there was mystical, and it was an adjective, and you had mystical traditions, and it was a Christian, it was a Greek term that became Latinized and then Christianized, but like you had mystical traditions, mystical readings of texts, mystical hermeneutics, exegesis, then became mystical theology, and
It would come out of the Greek mysterion.
Right. But it becomes at the beginning, right at the beginning of Enlightenment, it becomes a noun. You get mysticism as opposed to mystical something, and then it becomes secularizable because it's no longer attached to religion specifically.
Huh.
And they start globalizing it and broadening it to mean other mystical traditions. So like you get Christian, like Kabbalism, right? So like whatever. But you also get in the 19th century, a lot of Indian, mysticism and Sufism begins to be noticed by the British empires, basically, and people in those spheres. This is the reification, though, right? This was this is the whole Wittgenstein's, using of language. Once you turn that adjective into a noun, it actually allowed it to be divorced from religion and be its own thing, and then it becomes an attack point. This was what the comment that you responded to, Father, right? That once mystical becomes its own thing, the people who are claiming to be mystical try to find it within their traditions. They go back to Eckhart and St. John of the Cross, and then further back even, and they create like a new hagiography of mysticism. They redefine what it means as a noun, and kind of to a standalone concept. And then what you get at the beginning of the 20th century with William James, and a little earlier in the late 19th century with Schleiermacher, is they psychologized the term mysticism. Now it's about phenomenology and experience. And they do that to protect it from modernity. They do that to protect religion from modernity by saying, you can't criticize my religious experience. Religious experience is the root of mysticism, and mysticism is the root of all religion. This also, of course, allows for globalization, right? Like, because now you have a whole cosmopolitan perennialism coming up and all that stuff. But it's fascinating, this history and the way he lays this out, because it really shows. I mean, it encapsulates a lot of
Zevi, Slavin, is that who you said lays this out?
Yeah, Zevi, Slavin, yeah. Okay. Seekers of Unity is his YouTube channel, and his last 3 videos were this history. Okay. And they're short. I mean, all 3 of them are the length of one of yours, together. All 3 of them. So, and the third one's really just terminology. It's just kind of like the third one's just about like academic study of mysticism, kind of the debate between contextualists who say like you can't divorce it from, Christian mysticism can't be divorced from Christianity. It has to be part of the practice. Like you can't, and the texts and all that stuff. Kabbalah can't be divorced from Judaism and the practice. Whereas like the perennialists are the opposite, right? That there is some core here, we can find it, we can accept it, and instead of tools from it, kind of very Vervaekian. But obviously, they unlike Vervaeki, I think, right? They do believe that whatever you access in that universal thing in your brain in a mystical experience is in fact, God, divine. It's not just some product of cognition, but some, right? So that is a difference. But so he has these 3 episodes, and this kind of race through 19th century and then basically late 19th century to the academic turn, and then the academic turn. But the whole point is that this captures so many different themes and like trends, right, across modernization and Enlightenment, especially like the idea that they would. And you see this in Kierkegaard too, right? This, or even earlier in the Enlightenment, with internal private religion versus like external civic religion, right? Where by making religion internal, like private religion internal, you protect it from external critique.
Yep.
You also do other things to it, though, that are not necessarily good for it. Exacting it from its context and like. And saying that the experience is what matters, not the external practice, or and he points out that tons of mystics, or not, or whatever, people who have religious experience, push
We
back
live
on
in a
this. They
time,
say you
though,
can't trust
filled
mystical
with all
experience. It's
kinds
not
of
about
awesome
mystical
people.
experience. It's not the
Some
essence.
similar to us, some
Like
different from
Eckhart
us.
says this, I mean, very clearly. Like
Sometimes
he
our
says that's
differences
not the
keep us
point. If it doesn't bring you to the love and compassion, like the perspectival knowing of in the world, then you've missed the point of mysticism, essentially. So whatever, it's great, but it's still I literally just finished watching it like a half hour ago, so it's still like percolating.
No, that's good. That's very germane. That's really helpful. Because you really see, I think, in there sort of the quintessential move of the secular. Because the secular does, I mean, the secular develops partly to handle, pluralism has to be dealt with in a certain way. Because all of us are aware that there are multiple ways of seeing the world, but we all need to see the world in one way. We can't have an integral self and just see the world. I mean, when we watch each other not being able to see the world through one lens, part of what I'm poking at Sam Harris is that, I mean, come on, dude. Pick your side. I'd have less complaint if you're over here or you're over there, but to just say, well, I'm married to Joey. No, you're not married to Joey. I think Jared would find that to be a little bit disturbing if I said I was married to Joey. So, and so secularity is sort of a way of, I think you're right, in terms of, okay, how will all of this really foundational stuff be managed? Well, let's sort of segment it off in different places, and then we can sort of go on with life. But that going on assumes a deep level of agreement about a whole bunch of stuff that we've sort of put underneath, put behind the curtains. And I think part of what we have now is that, well, the curtains have frayed and they're coming down, and the level of unity is no longer able to hold. And so, well, now we're going to have to talk about this stuff again. But there's a lot we're going to have to integrate everything that we've done since then. So I definitely going to check out those videos. They sound very germane to what I've been percolating on. So, and it's good to see Topher in here. For those, I was going to say, for those who this is common on the Bridges of Meaning Discord, but I don't know if I've ever live streamed the inside of your speaker repair shop. So
probably not.
No.
I was just going to add that hopefully all we do is have to talk about it. Hopefully it's just talk. In terms of, go ahead.
I've been observing Sam Adams, right? And his interactions with other Protestants, especially, right? So when I first saw him, I'm like, well, he's outside the wire, right? I don't have to worry about him all that much. And I've come to figure out how a Catholic mind and the American Protestant mind might work a little bit differently. And so I've never really butt heads with him, I disagree with him, but I've never really gotten kind of visceral about it, It's all kind of remained pretty heady. And part of me is wondering, you talk about how the religious spirit of our ancestors encodes our responses to things in ways that we're not properly able to understand. I think somewhere in the back of a lot of our Trinitarian debates is the religious spirit of the Peace of Westphalia. It was like, we agree on this, and we are not going to kill each other anymore.
That's right.
And all of a sudden, in comes the American Unitarians, and you just go berserk back there because you're sensing danger, you know?
I think that's very true. And again, when I've made this comment before, when Sam first sort of appeared in our community, even when he just wrote me an email, it's like, I can talk to Buddhists and atheists, and I can talk to all kinds of, but if I talk to a Unitarian, suddenly that code sort of wells up. It's like, oh, so, okay, calm down. And And so, I mean, that's part of what we've been treading on in this space. And it's, of course, Jacob came in here in some ways, guns blazing. On one hand, oh, Jesus is really cool. On the other hand, Paul of Tarsus, what a fraud. Whoa. Whoop.
Credit to Sam, though, in that he's both probably the type of person and has worked to be the type of person that can have those conversations in a way that maintains the friendships.
Right.
A lot of people will come in and try and have those really tough conversations at the expense of the group that they're talking to, and Sam doesn't do that.
Yeah.
Jacob, he sometimes did that a little bit, but Jacob always reeled it back in too. Jacob always made it very clear that he could play both sides of not the argument, but he could play both the I'm going to be very intense and I'm going to be not very intense. Yeah. And that helps people, I think, separate the argument from the person.
Yep. Where
people who are always on and always very intense, that are they the idea or are they the person? It's harder to figure out which one you're dealing with there. And people like dealing with people. They don't like dealing with manifestations of ideas disguised as people.
Yeah. And Sam had to develop all of those skills because he, for the most part, has been living as a Unitarian in a Trinitarian world. Hey, there's Cassidy.
Hi.
It's always good if at least one woman joins the live stream.
I'm the token lady. I'll play the part.
So and I think you're right, Joey, in that Sam had those skills, and I mean Sam even confesses now that he gets a little nervous, and understandably so. Calvinists did not tolerate Servetus terribly well. But so the Calvinists understood that Servetus would have been killed in France or Italy or Spain just as easily in Geneva. It's kind of the okay, well, we'll all agree on these things, and I think that's a great point, Father Eric. That along comes the Unitarians, and it's like, ooh.
That's why Unitarianism is always sprung up in America, right? Because we've got laws against that sort of thing, religious violence.
That's true. But it's deep. It's deep in terms of the coding of America as well, and it's interesting. Right now, for example, there's often for Americans, Canada is just kind of America with a queen, with different money, but lately Canada's been, oh, wow, this is interesting. Don't have a First Amendment. I guess that First Amendment means something. That's some pretty deep coding that got in, and it's Enlightenment coding. I mean, Christians should fess up to that.
What levels does freedom live at? Does it live at the right to move where you want to move? Does it live at the right to have the job you want to have? Does it live at the right to say what you want to say, or say what you think, or say what you don't think? Mm-hmm. Like, which one of those things is the straw that breaks the camel back on free or not free? I mean, it's probably not that simple and not that one-dimensional, but it's a question.
That's why the institution that actually seems to handle these questions the best is seems like the court systems handle that based on the Constitution, and that's an opponent processing kind of hacking it out rather than strictly theoretical.
Mm-hmm. Well, and courts, I was thinking, so I was watching the Rebel Wisdom video this morning, rewatching it with David. I'd never heard of the guy. He's a doctor that's on YouTube, talks about COVID. He was just on Rebel Wisdom. But, I thought, why David Fuller continues to impress me in terms of the lines that he walks? Well, today I figured out part of the reason that one of the things that he and I have in common is that he's trying to walk this authentic individual versus institution line. And he's doing it sort of in this new media space. And he's asking questions about, well, once PVK has a YouTube channel and I start talking about myself in the third person, I sort of migrate over towards becoming an institution myself. And, Joe Rogan, I mean, that's this whole Joe Rogan controversy too. Is Joe Rogan an individual or is Joe Rogan an institution? Get big enough. And so the news media has been disrupted by the institutionalization of the authentic individual, as increasingly has the medical establishment. Almost all of our major institutions, we so far haven't had, well, we've sort of had rock star judges. I mean, that Ruth Bader Ginsburg was awfully popular for a while. So, but, what if a Supreme Court justice decided to get a YouTube channel and start hot takes on, current events in the news?
Impeach them immediately.
So there's all these different levels. And part of what social media has done is sort of that there was, okay, you've got, I've been on radio now a couple of times in the last couple of weeks. And every time I do that, it's like, okay, we've got 15 seconds. It's like, we're going to do this in 25 minutes. Really? 25 minutes? I'd take 2 hours. You guys get to hear me talk all the time. I come on here to hear you guys talk. Whole bunch of people just plopped in, so have at it.
Can I be heard?
Yes, I hear you.
Yes.
Okay. It's interesting that you, I don't know, the gentleman in the blue flannel talking about what level does freedom exist on. And then, Paul, you got into am I an institution, individual, etc.? And this is something I think Peterson has brought up, this idea of superorganism. I'm, to a certain degree, as a human being, I'm a superorganism made up of a bunch of different organisms that we call cells that add up into organs that add up into me as a human being. And then me as a human being might add into a family or a church or a school or an institution. And that, to a certain degree, gives us a bit of a framework to start working some of those things out. At what level does my heart have a right? Or my liver, my liver is faulty. I want to replace it with somebody else's liver. Well, does that liver have rights? Only in as much as it is controlled by my individual consciousness as a person. And I don't really have an answer to where that's going, but it's an interesting pathway of thought to start trying to answer some of those questions. What are the rules for these superorganisms, so to speak?
That's a really interesting way to frame it. Does my liver have rights? The whole concept would be, okay, well, yeah, go ahead. This is basically an argument the Apostle Paul made. Go ahead, divorce your liver. See how that goes. Does your liver have rights? Is that quite the right framing? Divorcing my liver would be a bad idea.
I kind of like staying in polyamory with my kidneys, though. I think I'll do that.
Livers grow back.
I've definitely abused my liver.
And your liver remains faithful to you to this day.
I love we got some open studio vibe going on here in the live stream. We've got Topher's shop and we've got Chad's workspace there. So I think that's awesome. What are you doing, Chad?
I'm mixing up some dry pack right now. I'm actually about to clean up, so that's wonderful. What are you doing? Who are you pissing off now, Paul?
Oh, yeah, well, I don't know. I had an hour, and I was going to sit down and work on some of these ideas, but I thought, well, I don't know if I'd get it all in an hour, so why don't I turn on the live stream and, oh, here's Luke. Let's turn off the camera.
Oh, this is what I was hoping for. I was going to ask. I'm requesting I'm requesting a sit down between you two guys, and I want to hear you guys settle this.
Me and Luke, we're going to settle it. Does Luke have a problem with me? Has Luke been going off on me on the Voxer?
Is this where I'm supposed to talk?
I don't know, Luke.
I just came in because you were praising everyone for showing their workspace.
Oh.
So I just wanted to
show your basement.
I just wanted you to tell me good job, Paul.
Oh, Luke, you know you have a special place in my heart.
No, I don't. Chad, you are you said that this morning that you wanted me and Paul to talk, but I'm not even sure about what. So, I mean, we always talk about things in the Voxer. We were talking about the Sam Harris stuff, and I don't know. It was, it was fine. It was good. I sometimes, I don't know. I don't know what Chad was wanting me to say. Sorry.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I would just wanted to chime in. You brought up Paul and the issue of freedom. I mean, it's always, I think it was the most difficult part of moving to Christ and understanding the easy yoke. So that freedom that we wish to have really is a freedom that most people wouldn't want when it comes to being subjected to your own heart. And so the bond servant that we are to Christ is the lack of freedom that I would desire when the freedom that I once pursued was actually slavery. So I find it to be a somewhat silly pursuit to pursue my own desires of freedom, despite my own best ideas.
Now, what you said, I think, was pretty coded in Christianese, and I think a lot of people who aren't Christian might not understand. Can you flesh that out a little bit more?
I mean, the idea that you don't really know what you want. You think you know what you want, and the ultimate freedom would be pursuing what I want.
Okay.
But those wants typically don't end the way that you had once envisioned them, and even if they do, there's no end to you wanting more, and they'll eventually end in a sort of lackluster or maybe less than satisfying way. So your never-ending pursuit of freedom to get what you wish to achieve will lead to usually lack of complacency or anxiety or something like that, because the outcome maybe wasn't what you had once desired. So that freedom to yourself is its own sense of slavery to your desires.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I'm pretty sure we could legislate freedom from negative outcomes. That's something we'll work on.
I definitely value the freedom to pursue destroying myself, though. I think that's okay. I think that's a strong and good value to have, because I need to know what the boundaries are.
And not everyone's boundaries will be the same. I mean, the church has gone round and round with respect to alcohol, in that for some people, alcohol is not a self-destructive thing. For other people, it is. And so then you get this framing issue of, well, at what level of how does society as a whole, sort of back to the secular thing, how does society as a whole modulate that? And of course, the United States had this big experiment in that, in prohibition, and basically the country decided prohibition was a failure. And we're currently having similar conversations with respect to other chemicals that we ingest in our bodies. So, but not all chemicals are the same. Alcohol is one thing. Pot is another thing. These psychedelics are different. Heroin, I forget the doctor that Peterson had on posted. Esther, of course, pointed me to it. My source of all things culture war. Canada was giving away fentanyl to homeless people because they wanted it. It's like, wow, That's just wow.
We've been doing that for a while. That was part of the San Francisco lockdown as well. Was they put them up in hotels and they supplied them with all the drugs and alcohol. Not that they wanted, but that they thought matched their current consumption levels because they wanted. You know this. Part of the reason people don't go to homeless shelters is because there's rules. Well, and they needed them to be inside because they rightly or wrongly thought COVID was a grave enough threat. And so in order to get them to go inside, they gave them whatever drugs that they were used to taking.
Yeah. The funny thing is that they were probably all safer outside. Like most of the homeless people I know. I don't know a single homeless person with COVID. They're all living outside, soaking up the vitamin D, all the fresh air.
But really, at some point, this whole conversation of freedom and constraint is kind of, I mean, that's the base conversation almost at everything, in law versus spirit and what it means to be, really. I mean, I was trying to think about how to respond without making this too esoteric, because just to use a practical example, the drug one, well, I mean, I can lean pretty libertarian when it comes to drugs and decriminalizing drugs, but that only works when you have a cultural consciousness or a zeitgeist or like you could say it this way. Let's do it this way with the Vervaeke incarnation, embody, incorporation. You need like a cultural body that can handle that freedom. If you don't have a cultural body that can handle that freedom, I mean, it'll go crazy. Like, I mean, you don't want to give a bunch of unhealthy people just free access to drugs or housing or whatever without responsibility. It'll destroy them. However, there are cultures that I think, like Portugal has done this, Uruguay or Paraguay has done this. I think there are some cultures, or even like I saw there was this really radical prison reform in one of the Scandinavian countries. But what you can't do is take this personal application in a certain cultural context and then universalize it and say it's going to work. You can't make that spirit that manifested in a way that worked and then universalize it and make it a law and apply it to all people at all times. It doesn't work.
On what level would it work is, I think, one of the questions. Because like, if it works on a Scandinavian country, which has a population of what, like 4 million, similar population to Chicago where I'm at, but I don't think it would work on that level. Like, at what level of heterodoxy do you need? How big the population? And I think those are some of the questions that need to be hashed out. Does it work? And then what are the specifics behind where it works?
Well, but this is the problem, though, is I don't think it's just a matter of scale either. And I don't think you can ever formalize it. I mean, this gets into why I'm a personalist versus like and I think personalism is like the opposite of thinking in this machine mechanistic mode. Is like we want to try to like systematize and strategize how to bottle the spirit, is what Chad the Alcoholics called it once. And I don't think you can. The spirit moves where it wills, which doesn't mean that there's not discernment and wisdom and how to handle it. But I don't think you can make a law to figure out how to get certain outcomes.
Right. So
the biggest problem with that is there's the unintentional consequences.
Yes.
What we think will happen doesn't always work out in reality, and it's really hard to understand what those outcomes actually are going to play out outside of systems, especially when we're talking about laws or economics or certain things that are supposed to make life better. And there's a certain value in freedom. I mean, I'm American. I'm freedom's ingrained in my ideologies and what I think, but I also think there's a huge responsibility in that we often don't recognize. And this idea of, well, I have the freedom to destroy myself if I'd like. Well, surely you do, but you have to recognize that freedom that you are, utilizing is not just impacting yourself. There are all of these unintended consequences for other people. And I mean, if we're talking about drug use, especially that, it's often seen as a single issue of substance abuse. But anybody who has a family member or a friend who struggled with that knows it does not stay isolated within the behaviors of which the person who is taking them. And we all have a responsibility to deal with that on our own individual way. But outside of some moral code that keeps us grounded in something good of putting life into the world and not death, personal freedom is scary. And I don't think anybody truly wants full freedom for every individual.
So this is where I want to bring in this concept of the container, right? So we don't want to make rules and laws to constrain people, right? But we want to have the spirit, right? Because the spirit is the thing that will move us in the right direction if we let it. But then there needs to be a place for the spirit, right? And that's why the container idea is handy, right? Because instead of imposing laws, you create a set of affordances that reliably allow something to manifest. And when you start thinking in that way, instead of imposing things upon people, then you gain more flexibility and you give people the space for self-expression. And I think that's where the attention needs to go.
And I think that's helpful because it nicely bridges a lot of the addiction talk was first simply assumed that these substances sort of completely hijacked the individual and took away their agency. Whereas, to go back to Grim Grizz's and his Rats of Nim, addiction comes where there is a breakdown of the container, a breakdown of wholeness. And this is in some ways analogous to this amazing clip. I really should clip it out and put it on my own Vanderclips channel that Karen had in a video not too long ago, where basically a cancer doctor was making the point that you've got these cancerous cells. If you put these cancerous cells into a healthy body where all the other cells are talking, the cancer cells don't multiply and in fact they die. But you put the cancer cells into a body where the cells are not talking well with one another. In other words, the body itself isn't functioning well. That's when the cancer begins to basically just take over. In other words, addiction and the individual is connected to the health of the individual. And that's where I think Manuel's container, and can mention Mark in there because he always talks about the container too. So
I really appreciate this talk about the container. I'm connecting your video that you posted today, Paul, where you were talking about the attention and its connection to agape.
Yep.
And this broader conversation that's happening in various different areas of this corner, where people are kind of making this effort to develop whatever they call practices or whatever, this effort to bottle the spirit. And how there's this sort of obvious truth that there are things that work that help us to sort of observe ourselves, and that self-observation is necessary. And yet the description of sort of the healthy container or the healthy contents of the container, whether that's an individual or a group, is it can't be sort of turned into a legal code, even because there's this distinction between you try to contain the concept with the word, you defeat your purpose. I'm not even sure how to exactly say it. It's not that you defeat the purpose, because I wish I could remember exactly your words earlier, where you were asking in a hypothetical way for Sam Harris to sort of go ahead and participate in the conversation. Like at some point you have to accept the terminology loosely enough to have a conversation. At some point we have to accept the sort of trends and truths of the way that people interact and become self-aware to say, well, there are some principles that apply fairly universally. And it's important that we recognize that a healthy approach to maybe academic study is not necessarily the same healthy approach to intimate relationship or something like that. There are all sorts of different domains of health and personhood and community that it makes sense to try these different approaches. there's value also in finding the I can't remember who was talking about the dock being a place of transition. Like, you can be both a land dweller and a seafarer, and so there are these cool docking points. And what purpose does the dock serve? What are these transitionary languages that allow us to go from one domain to the next and make partnerships and trade across these boundaries and participate more effectively as a whole? Anyway, I've said enough.
No, it was great. It was great, Shane. It was wonderful.
Yeah, I want to add something about this idea of controlling things, right? So we want to control things because if we have control, that's good, because then we can reliably manifest something, right? But if we start controlling something in a conversation, then what we do is we pay attention to it, right? Like, we feed it, we make it bigger, and thereby let it have control over us, right? Well, the right thing often, right, sometimes it isn't, but often the right thing is just to ignore it, right, and just let it recede into the background, so it cannot take over what is manifesting, right? And there's this tension, right? Because when I meditate, like, a lot of my struggle in meditation is, oh, like, I have this feeling here, or this wave, my attention is drawn here, right? And then I have to deal with it, right? But now I'm in a struggle with what's happening inside of me. And, like, when I'm in the struggle, I can't get out of it. And, like, I am not sufficient, right? Like, I cannot be my own source of getting out of it, right? So I need to appeal to something ineffable in order to have a way to direct my attention where it's not within me, but outside of me, so that I can come into peace. And, like, that's a little bit the steps that I've been going through, but I see that happening in bigger fractal patterns as well.
I think you're right on about the control aspect of it all, where, like, I mean, especially in sort of a Western frame, we want control of our lives. We want to create the order and the structures so that we can be our own destiny makers. And if I've learned anything in the last 5 years, it's I am far less in control than I ever I ever truly acknowledge. And
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say about Manuel, this idea of releasing that control to something bigger. And I just had a talk with Chad about this, about AA and that idea of, the 12 steps and all that, and submitting something to a higher power in whatever way you can see it. Like, a lot of way that is super helpful in the processing of these symptoms of sort of these fear mechanisms, or these places where we feel out of control. And that can be very helpful in, like, putting it in somebody else's hands. But I think as a broader culture, as it gets more secular, we've lost the confidence and the belief of something more effable and bigger than ourselves to put control in. And so what do? We make more structures. We do exactly what's on the first 3 pages of the Bible, of taking good and evil on our own terms and defining that and ruling the world outside of something bigger than ourselves. And if we keep doing that, we're going to get the same result.
This has me thinking of the role of responsibility versus control. Like, I'm responsible for certain things that I don't have control over. And so there's an element of it that is sort of a confession, the same play between humility and humor. I need to sort of detach myself from a mistake in order to be able to laugh at myself. But it doesn't work the same externally. Like, I don't want to, like, there's a level of detachment that can be dysfunctional, or a level of laughing at somebody else's folly that is cruel. And so responsibility has a similar dynamic, in that I am responsible for certain things that no one else is responsible for. And I can accept that and own that, but I need to have a healthy understanding that that doesn't mean that I'm in control of it, or should be. And so there's a weird play of accepting and owning while holding loosely and not assuming control as either something that I ought to have or can have. And there's a strange relationship there that I don't even know how to explain, but seems relevant.
As you guys are talking, the image that I keep getting in my mind, and I don't know how well this will play in this audience, is of a Soul Train line. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the idea of a Soul Train line. It happens at parties where there's a song happening and everybody lines up and one person at a time comes down and they do a dance. And they can do whatever kind of dance they want. Some people use it as an opportunity to show off. Some people, like myself, who are less confident, will do something silly to create a laugh. But everyone gets to participate, and there's these unofficial control measures, because it reminds me of a dance. A dance is controlled. There is a pattern in which you have to come through, but there is also a flexibility in it. You can't just go around. You can't really do a mosh in a Soul Train line. You can't just hit people and run into them. So there's these rules or methods of control, so to speak, but they're not super firm, if that makes sense.
I maybe as the nomian / legalist here, but right there. Laws have, right, I mean, going back to the drug initial conversation, right? I think when Luke was talking about it, he framed it as certain cultures, and this has worked in certain cultures, but they're really policies that have worked, and they're fairly new policies. They're not necessarily inherent in these cultures or like long-standing things. And policy, like, and this goes to Manuel's point about control. Like, we want control. He put it as for, I guess, to repeatedly manifest something, but we need policy to generalize. We need policy, for instance, we're all coming from different places. If we want to live together, we need some sort of bare minimum where we can agree that this is like the minimum of how we're going to act together and like not hit each other in the Soul Train line or whatever. Yeah. That's one part of law, and like the purpose of kind of setting a lower bound, let's say, on behavior or something. Another part, though, is, and this, I guess, is why like living, like the living constitution, right? Or for like the idea of a living legal system or dynamic legal system is one that has flexibility in it. And that's not setting the bare minimum. That's kind of setting like a norm or a standard that's flexible to either side. It's kind of like the, I don't know, Aristotelian middle way type thing, where you have some flexibility, but this is kind of the norm we're trying to keep and get to at the end of the day, which kind of is where the courts tend to take us. They tend to try to keep us within certain bounds around those norms, though sometimes they are enforcing the bare minimum. And we can look at both of those frames, I think, is useful here, because as long as we're not living in a society where we all, unless we're all sharing the same religion and values and culture and totally homogenous, you're going to have to. I mean, this is why the legal system, like this whole point of separation of church and state as a legal concept, is because you needed it to bridge across cultures. You needed to be able to generalize. As what nice as personalism is, and like I'm very sympathetic to that whole project. It doesn't generalize, because this goes to my point when we first started, Paul, right? And Father Eric, right? That there's this fundamental tension between love and personalism and the individual, and kind of being able to generalize to things, and that includes making policy and law. And that's just, we have to live in that tension.
I think the tricky part comes when you have laws built on laws, built on laws, built on laws, where they're not necessarily abolished, but there's adjusted and changed, and you've got all of these different. I'm speaking mostly for America because it's a very interesting, different system than a lot of other systems. But you have the federal law, which is the minimums, right? But then all these other states have their own individual laws that at least have to meet the minimum of the federal laws. But then they can be different from city to city. And so then you have all of these little intricacies and differences, and then there's this tension and chaos of what it means. And then you have people writing laws who there are certain places where people can write laws who have never written laws before, get it pushed through, and it has to be, adopted as written. There's some crazy things about how it is. Like, the idea of it's great, but I think America has scaled so much, and it's lost so much of sort of a consistency that's hard to figure out where those boundaries. I don't even know what Luke means when really says personalism. So I'm not advocating for that, but there is this certain tension of like, how do you find that place where, you know, you're working with a smaller community, because there's laws that are being passed for huge swaths of people that have no idea what's going on in the communities and how it'll actually, you know, adapt. And there's so many people in their communities who've just opted out because the laws are purposely written to be very confusing so that they don't understand what's going on, what's the implications. And then the other part is like, what happens when the legal system and politics become religion? That's another dynamic where it's like we're trying to separate church and state, but the state becomes a church.
Yeah, the
Church
thing that it sounds
smuggling.
like. Oh, go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead, Chad.
I was just thinking about that, like when you were talking, I said, there's like a degree of church smuggling or something like that. Like, yeah, it's not well defined. Holy crap, I'm breathing hard. Sorry.
Well, like I just did a film that touched on some like local law stuff, and so it's been something I've been pondering a lot. But you hear rhetoric coming from the right or the left, whatever team you want, that says these things. This is what this law does, and this is why we stand for these things. And it becomes a certain dogma, and then it becomes, well, this is the right thing to do, independent of how it actually affects communities, how it works in things, and it becomes the truth, even if it doesn't match what's happening in reality. And I've had people, and the film kind of touched on minimum wage stuff, but I'd had conversations with people, you know, just friends saying, oh, I know minimum wage laws have a lot of negative ripple effects, but I vote for it anyways because that's the right thing. And it's like, well, you know, it's not helping the way the rhetoric is saying, yet you're still supporting it. It's wild. And it's like, how do we find this way to break it up from just talking points and religious propagation, or whatever the word is?
Yeah, I think that they were talking about the law, but we're also talking about the application and enforcement of the law, and then whether or not anyone could meet the standard of the law. And so, like, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, there's the law that's described in the New Testament and the Old, the nomos. That law is a set standard that we agree to, and the application of this law is the more difficult part of that. And the fact that we can admit our failure to meet that law's standard despite our best efforts. And so when we get into the point where we say, well, we have the answer here, we have the proper law as defined by man and the proper application of that law so that it will be followed and then justice will prevail. And when it doesn't happen, we're upset and we find we must create a new law for this to occur, as though perfection is even possible. And I think that, like, the little bit of humility in admitting the flaws that we have in the interpretation, application, and understanding of these laws we put into place, there needs to be a higher order that we fall under, and admit the fact that it's going to be impossible for us to meet this standard.
Well, you would put so many people out of work if you did that. Like,
I think it would create more jobs.
You think? Well, yeah, maybe. It's just
Well,
crazy to me because, like, it seems like there's like people who have a strong desire to change law or impose law. It's like that in itself seems like a type of game, and it seems, I don't know, not genuine, whatever. But yeah, sorry about that. Sorry.
I love the reference to the Old Testament law because it reminds us of who the law was for. The law was not for Israel to start executing judgment against others. It was for them to see their inability to claim righteousness. And through that obvious understanding that really didn't manifest until they saw Jesus, they're able, we who understand that are able to say, oh, it is my absolute failure and the gift of grace that allows me to love my fellow man. not judge my fellow man. Like, we're still being judged by the same law, but there's a difference between using that law to frame our position in humility rather than using it to condemn people outside ourselves.
Well, I think the issue of motivation is important, and sometimes when I think about this, I think that part of what's going on in the background is what we'd really like is for people to choose to do the right thing, to know the right thing to do, and to choose to do the right thing of their own accord, right? And law in the negative sense, like Joseph was talking about, right, which we've talked about on here before. It's an issue of compulsion, right? It's an issue of setting a base minimum standard that if you don't do this, there's going to be consequences, right? And I would say that to say that that's completely evil means parenting is evil, right? I heard somebody point out that they said something along the lines of like parenting is a necessary but good tyranny, right? And when kids are little and they don't know the difference, they don't know why they don't need to run in the street, right? But they're not going to be allowed to go play in the street. I mean, it's just one of those things. And if I got to spank them or whatever, right, or ground them or whatever, that's I'm going to be tyrannical in that sense. And it's not necessarily tyrannical just to be mean, but it's for their good.
Yeah.
And so that negative sense of the law, the compulsion sense of the law, it's always it's not what we'd like, right? It's not the best, right? But it's necessary.
I would point out that it's explicit. I mean, this is clear in Tanakh, right? In the Old Testament, is very clear that the way that the law is designed to be implemented for Israel is meant to inculcate these as things that eventually become in the heart. Right? This is the whole, right? They start off as, let's say, external propositions that are being compulsory. But the whole point is that they're going to get habituated, and you're going to align yourself with the values with which the law, exemplify, and they're going to become embodied, perspectival, all those wonderful, fun things, because that is how that set of law is designed, and that is, and not just internally, but like the meta legal aspects of how it's supposed to be implemented is how it's designed.
I think, well, you make yourself in the vessel of the spirit of the law, right? Which is like a completely different level, right? Like, and I think this came up yesterday in the live stream, and Paul didn't like this idea of leaving the dogma behind, but I think that's what it is, right? Like, you have the dogma, you have the law, and then when it's part of you, you leave it behind, and the spirit is taking it forward. And I think that's the right way to conceive of that.
But you still need it for the next generation, right? For whoever's joining.
Oh yeah,
right?
yeah. I'm talking from the individual perspective.
Behind as an institution, because you still need it for newcomers.
Yeah, it's a means of preservation.
Or accounting for the mistakes and misgivings you have when you no longer have integrated it well and you've fallen away from the principles you thought you had integrated.
It's there to manage consistency. This is the Manuel. What was Manuel's term? The repeatability for manifestation or whatever. You need to have it there to guarantee consistency in the future and repeatability.
Well, and part of the reason I don't like leave it behind is I think it's not. I think the best term is, let's say, what Jesus talks about in the Sermon on the Mount. You're looking for the fulfillment of the law. You want to see the law achieve its telos, because the law is always pointing to the point of the law is not the stipulation or the restriction. The restriction serves an end, and I think that's where Bruce was going. The restriction serves an end, which is its fulfillment, and it's there's, in terms of Protestant theology, Lutherans and Calvinists. This is an ongoing conversation between Lutherans and Calvinists because Lutherans tended to set up a large duality, law versus gospel, and Calvinists basically wanted to say gospel fulfills law. And so law doesn't go away. Law continues to have a role, but law and gospel have to be seen as pursuing a telos, which is the kingdom of God in Jesus' words.
Yeah, that's the law. The gospel is a command just as much as the law is, right? This is the pursuit you should follow. These are the rules.
Yeah,
so
It's not a suggestion.
I think the problem is,
a little bit back to culture.
One at a time. One at a time.
When the law becomes I think the law, for me, the law is something that I get to bump up against. It shouldn't be used as something as a weapon, though. And I think that's where it gets kind of nutty. That's why I say I do value being able to have the freedom to hit the wall. I value it. Now, I may not like the consequences, but I like the freedom of being able to find what that is. Now, I'm very much against this idea of using the law as a weapon against somebody else to contain somebody else. I know that doesn't sound very logical or whatever, but it's hard to explain what I'm trying to say with that, though. I don't know if that's
just a program note, because I have to leave, and that means that the live stream is ending. But anybody out there watching the live stream that wants to participate in this conversation, the link is below here. Just jump into the room, and I just want to thank you all for jumping in here and participating, because again, when I come into this room and when we turn on the cameras and when I listen to your wisdom, I grow. And so thank you all for being here, and sorry to have to run, but keep doing what you're doing. I wish I could. In a better world, I'd just leave the live stream going and I'd go off and do things, but that gets a little scary.
In the land of the lawless, you can't do that.
What's that?
In the land of the lawless, you cannot do that.
This I could not. If Rick were here, I'd let Rick moderate it. But Rick has his day job. So anyway, thank you all. So keep going.
Nice speaking to you.
Yeah.